Welcome to the fourth and final video lecture for week 2 of Business Ethics, Lehman College, Fall 2023. Here is the cover of our online textbook, which you can access through the OpenStax website. A quick Google search will help you find it, but also I'm going to link the online homepage of the book at the top of our Blackboard announcements section. Oh, before I get started, I wanted to let you know a little logistical thing about my apartment. There's a lot of neighbor noise. There isn't really dampening between the ceiling and my apartment. So if you hear noise and banging, that's probably it, and I apologize in advance. It's getting started again right now. I don't know how much you can hear. I hope it is not too much of a distraction. First chapter, Why Ethics Matter, the main topic of our first week, in which they break down the chapter into 3 main sections, being a professional of integrity, ethics and profitability, Note that this is the topic of our group discussion for this week, and multiple versus single ethical standards. You can see it branded in the top right corner. These are the slides that come with the book online for free. I'm not going to use them every week, probably, or I'm going to modify them. We'll see. I haven't used the slides before. This is the same image as the first page of our book, in which we figure out what their definition of ethics are. And it's very similar to how academic philosophers would define it, but this reminds me a little bit about how I have mentioned in the past we're going to have supplemental readings from philosophers themselves, because this book is written by business professionals, aimed at future business professionals and the challenges that they're going to face in their professional life. But as such, sometimes they get things a tiny bit wrong when it comes to the philosophy itself, which is okay, as long as we get the main point across. You guys aren't philosophers, and we want as much meaningful takeaway as possible and not get lost in the details. But that is one of the reasons that I have some of the supplements for you. This is the detailed breakdown of the first section. How do we become professionals of integrity? By the end of this section, you should be able to do these 4 things. Explain the role of ethics in a business environment. What does it mean to be a professional of integrity? What's the difference between our legal responsibilities and our ethical responsibilities? And what are 3 approaches that we can use practically to examine the nature of our decisions? So, of course, each and every one of us, every day, makes a ton of decisions. When do you want to wake up? What do you want to have for breakfast? What's your day going to be like? What are you going to wear? Those are the maybe perhaps more trivial ones. But everything that we decide can be judged. So there's a fact of the matter. You wore these clothes. You had this thing for breakfast. But was it a good choice? Was it a bad choice? That is a value judgment. And it seems to be the nature of human cognition or thought that we are making value judgments all the time. A pen is good if it writes smoothly and does not leak. A pen is bad if it doesn't write smoothly, if it's out of ink, or if it leaks all over your bag. When we apply good and bad to human behavior, that's when it becomes moral, in the domain of studying morality, which is all about right and wrong, good and bad. Then, when we take those academic studies and apply them to our life with a code of conduct, that is considered to be an ethic or a set of ethics. And that's what we're going to look at, the practical ethics of what it's like to operate in a business, corporate, or economic world right now. Why should we care? How might we implement it? And how do we decide what counts as good and what counts as bad? What counts as ethical and what counts as unethical? This is probably all review. Again, I'm aware you are all business majors. The difference between stakeholders and shareholders. Shareholders, part owners in the company, have stock, and you are directly beholden to them as members of a business, in general, to increase profit. But there are a lot of people and entities that are affected by a business's choices and actions. And in this book, we list them as customers, clients, competitors, community, and the environment itself, the government, media, the employees, retailers, investors, suppliers, and customers. All of these people's lives and the decisions available to them are affected by your choices as business people. So if we want to make decisions that align with our ethics, we have to consider the needs, desires, and strengths and weaknesses of all of these stakeholders. And here it is, the definitions, things that I'm sure are review for most, if not all, of you. One thing not in these slides that I'd like you to think about, it is in the book, is what your values are. You might automatically think that you know, but if you've never sat down and actually thought about it, reflected upon it, there may be contradictions. There may be things that you've assumed all along that you don't really adhere to once you stop and think. The way the book suggests to begin, especially within this context of business ethics, is to think about what success means to you. There are a lot of different definitions of success. And it could be wealth, status, power, recognition. These are all things squarely within the needs and desires of our shareholders. That is corporate and business success. But we know that human beings are driven by a lot of other motivations as well, like contribution to society, helping other people, improving ourselves, improving our world, finding meaning, creating something, whether it's art or a company or a patent. All of these things compete with one another to become our system of core values, not to mention friends and family and loved ones. Once you think about this and you recognize that your definition of success probably isn't as narrow as only profit all the time, then we have already hooked ourselves in a little bit and understood why thinking about our ethics and our ethical decision matters. Our book tells us about ends, means, and character in business. If you've ever heard of the phrase, "it was a means to an end," you know what means and ends are, at least intuitively. Ends are our goals, whereas means are the methods we use to try and reach those goals. And someone can have the same goal or the same end, but radically differ with another person as to how they try and achieve it. Meaning, you're a business person, the person sitting next to you, well, no, we're not in class. Your fellow student is also a business person. You have goals to be good at your job, to be successful. And we can even say that you both have the goal of creating wealth for yourselves and your family. But how do you go about doing that? Do you do it ruthlessly, stomping people underneath your feet, ignoring whatever pain that you cause, profit as the only directive? Or do you have simultaneously the goal of becoming wealthy and making sure that you can enter into contracts that are mutually beneficial for you and whomever you partner with? improving or at least maintaining the environmental status of whatever your company does. Two different sets of means to the same end. So we're going to think a lot about both of them and how they are related to one another. Not in this chapter, but next week, we'll look at three different sorts of philosophical systems of analyzing ends and means to try and figure out which ones are the best, which ones will get us to the point in which we can say we are being ethical. These are called normative ethical theories. Now, normative means how things ought to be. In sociology, it means something a little bit slightly different. It's all about social norms. It's related, though. There's a certain way that the world actually is. Those are the facts. The way we think it ought to be is our moral and ethical judgment. And as far as we know, human beings are the only creatures on Earth that explicitly do this, that have this realm in which they think the world should match a certain ideal. Three of the major normative ethical theories throughout the history of Western philosophy have been consequentialism, all about consequences of our actions, deontology, which is all about what we owe to one another, and virtue theory, all about building character. So in each of these three theories, people have determined that the path to goodness, morality, or ethics lies within those aspects of our behavior, our goals, and the methods we use to get to those goals. So utilitarianism says that utilitarianism is a flavor of consequentialism. So consequentialism says only the consequences matter. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. What actually happened determines whether or not an action was ethical or not. Utilitarianism is a brand or variety of consequentialism, the most popular, most likely. And it says that if an action creates more good, it is a better action. If it creates more suffering, it is a bad action. Doesn't matter what you intended. Deontology is what we owe to one another and why. It's about rules. It's about the intentions instead of the consequences. And then finally, virtue theory is different in that it doesn't think we can measure good and bad in single actions. It thinks we need to look at our whole lives and developing our character to become ethical people. That's the quick overview. We are going to spend a whole week looking more deeply into these ideas. And then on this next slide, we get the poster boy, I guess you want to call him, for deontology. His system, Immanuel Kant, of morality is the most influential of the theories about what we owe to one another. He was an 18th century German philosopher, and he is influential in almost all areas of philosophy. If you're ever interested in learning about that, come to my office hours, we can chat about it. I don't 100% like the way they have the picture captioned. Reason depends on respect for rules. That's true, but it's misleading. What they mean is logical rules, I think. I might be wrong, in that if we're reasonable creatures, we recognize that some reasons are good for a belief or an action, some reasons are bad, and oftentimes when we have bad reasons, we're contradicting ourselves. And that is a logical rule, that generally something cannot be true if it contradicts itself. It's one of the foundations of thought. And it's how Kant generates his system of morality. He thinks it's a basis of non-contradiction. If we are logical creatures, we can reason out the fact that we need to respect one another. But again, we'll save that for next week. Now look at this. This is a mess. This is why I don't know that I'll be using these given slides the whole semester. I'm going to have to modify them at least a little bit. But okay. In the article cited, the author stressed the importance of well-being. I don't know exactly what they mean here. They talk about practical wisdom, ethics across time and culture. I'm going to take a look in the book and see and try to figure out what they're talking about. I looked at these before I started to record, but somehow I missed this. I feel like this is from chapter 2. We're going to not worry about this for a moment. Actually, I think it might be toward the end of the chapter. Let's take a look at it. In the article cited, don't know which article they're talking about, being well versed in the liberal arts such as philosophy, history, literature, and in the fine arts to cultivate judgment. How do you think a strong background in the liberal arts would help? Oh, okay. Right. So, in the history of Western education, so the Western world is generally Europe, the United States, the white English-speaking world traditionally. Of course, that is changing, as it should. And other countries have been referred to as the East or the Global South. And they have a different economic, philosophic, and educational, cultural history. We get handed down certain ways of thinking and believing and acting that have been in place for hundreds of years. And part of critical thinking and analysis is to figure out how that happened and how it influences our behavior today. So for this particular topic, for critical thinking, they are referring heavily to the history of liberal arts. So college in the Western world was developed to make people well-rounded individuals. You would learn a little bit about everything so you could become a cultivated citizen of your nation and the world. Make the best possible decisions in many different contexts. So you learn about math and science and politics and sociology and art and English and literature. But as time has gone on, with the Industrial Revolution and after, we have begun to specialize. For one thing, there's a lot more knowledge out there than there was in the Middle Ages and onward. As one person, you can no longer learn all that there is to know. And another thing is our jobs have become increasingly detailed and technical. We don't have the time or intellectual capacity to study all the things that are out there. So sometimes people have gone to college and only specialized, not looked at different ways of knowing in the world. And many people have lamented this because it can lead to very black and white type thinking. This is how things are done, everything else doesn't matter. We don't have context, we don't have perspective. In which, the theory goes, you will be a better critical thinker and better in your chosen field if you are at least slightly more of a well-rounded person. Because you'll know the feedback loops that go on between what it is that you do and the rest of society. Wherein if you aren't someone who is a little bit more broadly educated, you might not see those connections, those causes and effects. This is what's known as practical wisdom. There is a little bit of a box in our textbook about that, wherein you can study theory You can study its applications to the real world, but there is something to be gained that you cannot gain in any other way than through experience. You learn how to navigate the world as it is. Okay, second section in the chapter. We're already going a little bit long. I would normally break up these sections into multiple videos. There are already a lot of videos this week, so we're just going to power through, I think. In this section, 1.2, at the end, you should be able to differentiate between short-term and long-term perspectives, stockholder and stakeholder, ethical behavior, goodwill, and profit, discuss the relationship between those, and explain the concept of corporate social responsibility. So the first thing we can do, if we are students looking at this book, is maybe just go and look at the definitions that they give us before we try to fill in the context. Short-term versus long-term perspectives. We know that in many businesses in the United States, you are beholden to your stockholders quarterly, 4 times a year. That is very short term, and even in a human lifetime, let alone generations of kids, grandkids, and great-great-grandkids. Whatever is good for the next 3 months, not necessarily good for the next 10, 20, 50, or 100 years. And we can feel a whole lot of pressure to make that bottom line go up in that very short term. But we also recognize that there are things that we do in that short term that will affect the long term, as in climate change, right? In the short term, it is profitable to create a strip mine, to yank all the minerals and resources out of the ground that we can by any means necessary. But we know that in the long term, this isn't sustainable. This is going to damage the earth, or even at the very least, the community around the mine. Our book says, measuring true profitability, this is page 13, requires taking a long-term perspective. We cannot accurately measure success within a quarter of a year. A longer time is often required for a product or service to find its market and gain traction against competitors, or for the effects of a new business policy to even be felt. Satisfying consumer demands, going green, being socially responsible, and acting above and beyond the basic requirements all take time and money. But the extra cost will result in profits in the long run. If we measure success from this longer perspective, we are more likely to understand the positive effect ethical behavior has on all that are associated with the business. Now, you might be cynical. You might think of many examples of companies that have not acted ethically in the long term, and they're just fine. And that, again, might be true. It goes back to the beginning that I've told you before. There are always going to be dissenters. There are always going to be people that don't care. You have to decide for yourself whether or not you're one of them, and whether, as the argument goes, you, even selfishly, will be better off if the entire society is thought of more than just something to be overcome in the name of profits. So it's kind of like an individual short-term perspective versus building the kind of world in which our interdependence is respected and we raise up everybody's markers of success. That's sort of one of the major themes of the whole semester. We'll spend a long time arguing different aspects of that. Stockholder, stakeholder again, they're repeating themselves a little bit. Let's discuss the relationship between ethical behavior, goodwill, and profit. Like I said, good way to skim before we dive deep. We can say goodwill. I'm just looking for their definition. That was my pause. They say, the value of a business beyond its tangible assets. usually including its reputation, the value of its brand, the attitude of its workforce, and customer relations. So the more goodwill that we have, the higher the value of our brand will be, the more excited our employees will be to coming into work every day, and how we relate with the community is going to build consumer trust over time. They have an example of Toyota, I think it is, which came into the United States in the late 70s, early 80s, had no market share. People were distrustful of Japanese automobiles, and it took them decades to build up a positive goodwill with their consumers in the United States. Massively different time frame than quarterly. And we'll save corporate social responsibility till we get there. Our book mentions, of course, how some people think that the only job of a business is to increase profit, and that it's the job of government or the community to provide checks and balances to business activity in order to create the world that everyone would want, the community that everyone would want. So the economy is sort of an autonomous unit by itself with only one driving factor. But most people say no, not anymore. That businesses have to self-regulate themselves because they are members of society themselves. They're not some kind of autonomous, meaning unaffected or uninfluenced by what's going on around them, entity. They are an interdependent entity that depends upon not only employees and not only stockholders, but also the community that they live in, the goodwill of their brand to consumers, to clients, to manufacturers, and to retailers. We get someone who is widely thought of as one of the most ethical investors alive, Warren Buffett, here with President Obama almost 15 years ago now. This is from our book, in which we get a quote from Buffett himself. He says that he instructs his managers to operate on this principle. Do nothing you would not be happy to have an unfriendly but intelligent reporter write about on the front page of a newspaper. So this sort of is a question that cuts down to your deepest values. If something was splattered all over the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal's front page, how would you feel about it? The behavior that you're just about to choose. And here we come to the methods. How might you analyze this for a real-world practical decision? And they have, take a piece of paper or go onto a Word document online, make 3 columns. List all of the stakeholders that are affected by whatever decision you're about to make. List all the interests and goals that you can come up with for each of those stakeholders. And then list the impact of the decision you're going to make on those stakeholders and their goals. See what aligns, see what contradicts, and this can help you recognize the interdependence of your actions, your company, and the wider community. We get a couple case studies. There's one from the data breach in Equifax. That's an interesting one to think about if you wanted to think about profit versus ethical choices. That's on page 19 of our textbook. And as this is getting a little bit long, I do want to wrap this chapter up with the final concept, an introduction to corporate social responsibility. They give us this definition: the practice by which a business views itself within a broader context, as a member of society with certain implicit social obligations and environmental responsibilities. So this is a concept that, again, we're going to be debating and looking at from multiple different angles all throughout the semester. Does a corporation have a social responsibility? Why? Why not? Do you think that this kind of social responsibility can practically influence the direction of economic enterprise in the future? Why or why not? Here's the methodology that I've mentioned. And this is the very last part of the chapter, wherein they talk about, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop and think how I should do this. I think we just have to plow on at this point because I don't want to create yet another video for you. I just hope this file doesn't get corrupted. Okay. Multiple versus single ethical standards. I've taught ethics a lot. Fewer times I've taught it to business students, but business students and philosophy students alike have often told me that they're something like a moral relativist. They might not know the term, but the gist of it, the main point, is something that they truly believe in. When they think right and wrong is not absolute and objective. There's no one right and one wrong for every single decision that you might make. It depends on context. What's right and wrong here might not be the same as it is in South Africa or China. You can even make the point a little bit stronger by thinking about China 500 years ago or South Africa 500 years from now. Things are going to change. Our contexts do matter. And we know that throughout Western history, we've had a lot of things to be ashamed for. We have had a history of imperialism and white supremacy. So there's a good impulse behind not wanting to be absolute. Not only that, practically, when we make negotiations and contracts, other people's culture influences how they make their decisions. So if we want a contract or we want business with them, we have to be sensitive to the fact that they have different cultural systems and maybe think certain things are right that we think are wrong, and vice versa. So we might be tempted to say that we are relativists. There are serious problems, however, with being an absolute moral relativist. Because if anything is right and wrong, nothing is. You cannot praise any decisions made by anyone in your company, your culture, or the culture of someone else, because it's all relative. And you can't criticize it. There's no praise, there's no criticism, and there's no improvement. And we don't operate like that. Not at all. We certainly think that some things are actually objectively better than other things. Another thing I get from students is that morality is an opinion and we will never agree. That first part I do not think is correct. It's not. The second part, maybe. We might not never ever agree 100%, but we certainly use reasons and logic when it comes to making value decisions. And that means we think that there's something like a more right answer and a more wrong answer. Because facts, things that are beholden to reasons and evidence, are true or false. Whereas values are right or wrong, and they are not necessarily one or the other. When we talk about our moral beliefs, we talk about them both as values, but also sometimes as fact-like. It is right to do this and wrong to do that. Black and white, true or false. There might be more debate, but we can use logic and reasoning to come to an understanding of one another. Let's put it a different way. I think I'm being a little bit confusing. If you tell somebody that you prefer Coke to Pepsi, they can't say, oh, you're wrong, because that's what you prefer. They might prefer Pepsi, but that's their belief, that's their preference, that's their opinion. When someone says, I think abortion is immoral in all cases, it makes sense to say, what is your reason? It makes sense to expect reasons from people and evidence when they are talking about their moral belief system. It does not make sense to expect evidence from an opinion. There are certainly beliefs that are more well supported with logic, reason, and evidence, and beliefs that are less so. And that is one of the things that we study when we try and figure out the best ethical standard to pursue. So while there may not be one perfect ethical standard, there's probably not no ethical standards. And that's where we come with one single ethical standard. Everything is right and wrong by my criteria versus more relative, or something that's a little bit closer to in between. Okay, these are case studies that you can look at in the textbook itself. Remember that the assignment for this week is to think about the push and pull between profitability, ethical standards, and how you might balance them. This is it for this week. When it comes to video lectures, email for questions or comments, and I will talk to you next week.